Do we have the option to see people that are logging in?
Yeah, I think if you click on
The
attendees,
bottom of your screen where it says participants.
Oh, 65. That's great. We're just going to give a few more minutes for everybody to finish logging in. You guys can be patient for a second. We'll give another minute. All right. Well, I think the participation is slowed down. So thank everybody. Thank you everybody for joining us today. This is Southern California Builders Safety Alliance. We offer quarterly trainings. This is one of our trainings today. We're going to record this so you guys can use this later. We do ask for participation. There'll be a chat box that'll be operated, and if you don't want to say you have a silly question, or you might think it's silly or don't know how to ask it, you can click the anonymous button and your name won't be on the question and we'll get it answered to you. At the end of this presentation, there'll be a slide that will walk you through the steps on how to print your certificate. Today we have with us David G. from OSHA Consultation, and Amy Learn is with us, and she is going to walk us through some heat and illness prevention programs and slips, trips, and falls. Amy?
Thank you, Brad. Thank you for inviting us to your group today so we can review heat illness prevention programs. And obviously, for the past year, we've had to kind of leverage that with the COVID-19 exposures. I'd like to also thank David G. with Calosha Consultation, who was able to join us today to facilitate the chat box and provide his input and insight in regards to these challenges out in the field. So the first portion of our webinar today, we are going to talk about heat illness, and the last portion will be on slips, trips, and falls, which is a primary concern and contributor to our job sites and our projects. So we're going to talk about heat illness. We're going to talk about the common issues, obstacles, and concerns, and then we're going to have a discussion. So throughout this presentation, we have a lot of material to cover. Feel free to enter your questions or concerns in the chat box. David's going to be monitoring that. The speakers, or actually the facilitators, have access to identification in case you're a little concerned about identifying yourself. We can do that anonymously. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video, so that kind of minimizes that bandwidth, so it doesn't affect the audio and the slides. And Anna, I'm assuming that all the participants today will be able to get a PDF version of the presentation. Is that true?
They will, yes.
Okay, perfect, perfect. And I will also mention that participation certificates, if there isn't, when you sign into this presentation, your name isn't identified in the box, or it's just a phone number, please be sure that you contact Laura. There'll be an email address, contact address, and reach out to her so they can go ahead and acknowledge your attendance and send you an attendance sheet. Is there anything else I missed, Anna?
I think that covers it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to turn off my video, and we will continue. So heat illness prevention is something that I'm sure is near and dear to everybody's hearts when it comes to being warm here, specifically in Southern California. As John Johnson, chair of the ANSI ASSP A10 committee, states, you know what, there's tens of thousands of heat-related illnesses that impact our industry every year. And unfortunately, workers are still dying from these exposures to excessive heat. So it remains to be a forefront of a concern of Calosha and all employers here in California. And just as a reminder, even though we have a specific heat illness prevention program and standard here in the state of California, it also goes down to the general duty clause of, every employer has the responsibility to furnish, employees a safe place of employment free from recognized hazards, including, right, the new and emerging risk, COVID-19. So before I get into the meat of the standard, I want to remind everybody about some of the important definitions that are related to the heat illness prevention standard. Heat illness, it's a serious medical condition. Okay, it's your body's reaction and ability to cope with a heat load, right? Some of those things that are related to heat illness is heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat syncope, which is what we call, fainting, and heat stroke. Very, very dangerous conditions to the body. Some of the environmental risk factors for heat illness include, working conditions that include, the relative humidity, how humid it is outside. Some of you can sometimes look at weather reports where it says, hey, you know what, it's 75 degrees today, but it feels like 80. And that feels like temperature is with the imputed wet bulb temperature, the relative moisture in the air. And then also radiant heat from the sun. So heat from the sun itself, or reflective heat sources or conductive heat sources. Like if we're all working out on black tarmac, you've always seen that radiating heat that comes out from that the ground, right? Air movement, lack of air movement, and the type of workload that workers are doing and how long they're doing that for. And also protective clothing, PPE that's worn by employees. You're wearing a hard hat that's vented versus non-vented. Okay, so if it's a non-vented hard hat because you're working in electrical hazardous conditions, it's going to retain a lot more heat than a vented hard hat. And then, of course, now with COVID-19, with the requirements of wearing facial coverings, we have some people that elect with cloth facial coverings versus disposable facial coverings, or a lot of people like to wear the hood, the balaclava, and then the hard hat on top of that. So, those are additional heat loads. Personal risk factors for heat illness. That differs from person to person. What you did over the weekend, how much water you've consumed, your personal health level, health condition. Have you been acclimatized? Have you gotten used to what you're doing for this year? Just because you didn't have any issues getting acclimatized to the work or the workload that you did last year doesn't mean that the outcome is the same this year, okay? It's not a retained memory on your body saying, hey, you know what, I've done this work before and here it is again, no problem. So you have to have that awareness. How much caffeine you have. I know we all love our coffee. We love our caffeinated drinks. It gives us that pep and go for the day, but that affects your hydration level. And also prescription medications, anything that you might take medically could also affect how your body copes with heat, and also how your body retains water to deal with that heat. Our bodies are kind of like a vehicle. We have a cooling system, you have a radiator, you have water. If you don't maintain and observe how that's handled, your body's not going to be able to cope with that. As I mentioned before, acclimatization, that's how your body adapts to the heat. And usually it takes about 7 to 14 days for someone to get used to a new type of task under heat load. Okay. David, do you have anything to add about the acclimatization?
No, not at this time. You're doing good.
Okay. Shade, and I'm sure David will have something to add to this later. In general, shade is defined as we're blocking out direct sunlight. Okay, and one of the general indicators that the blockage of the sunlight is sufficient is when they don't cast a shadow. Okay, you have your shade area, and then you bring another object in there, you don't see a second shadow. That's the general rule. Okay, shade is not adequate when the heat in the area of shade defeats the purpose of the shade. Okay, it sounds a little bit like a conundrum here, but I just left an example here. Hey, you have a car that's sitting in the sun. It doesn't provide acceptable shade to a person inside it, right? Unless you have air conditioning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, we can also use shade provided by any natural or artificial means. Okay, but again, we want to talk about the shade shouldn't render a safe or unhealthy condition. And as an example, and I'm sure David could attest to this, is, you have a job trailer and the footprint underneath the job trailer, that shade, and you really don't want to have people laying underneath or seated underneath the footprint of a job trailer, right? That's not suited and designed for human occupation. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then also temperature. As I mentioned as an example before, you have the actual air temperature. That's what we call dry bulb temperature. Okay, basically a thermometer. And then we also have what we call the feels like the wet bulb type of temperature with the relative humidity factored into place. So we'll go into the Calosha heat illness prevention standard that we have here. And I'm going to, after each section, kind of give you some considerations that I'm sure all of you have had to deal with within the past 12 months, but just to kind of revisit, it's the weather is warming up outside, and it's good to think about being prepared and how you're going to handle this summer before it warms up. So CCR, California Code of Regulations, Title 8, addresses how you are going to provide water at your job site, how you're going to provide access to shade when we have high heat procedures, how we're going to have emergency response. Okay, should someone be exposed or they're having issues with heat illness, how are we going to respond to that medical emergency? Acclimatization of employees doing their work task, the type of training that's expected, and then your written heat illness prevention plan. So provision of water. There's the expectation that you're able to provide fresh, suitably cool water to employees free of charge. Now, there's different ways of meeting that requirement. I'm not going to read this verbatim, but in yellow, these are some of the key takeaways. So this is called pre-planning, right? There's some of your job sites, you have access to plumb maybe a water supply for workers that are on your site to replenish their own personal supplies. Where it's not practicable, maybe you unitize water. These days, of course, with COVID-19, you have to have a trade-off of, hey, if we have a communal water system, we're going to have to deal with sanitizing, social distancing. Should we have more access points to water? Should it be closer to where they're doing work? So that kind of minimizes people saying, hey, you know what, it's too far away. They're not going to go ahead and get the water that they need. David, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, in general, you want to keep your water close as possible to the workers. We've had court cases where employers have lost, where workers had to go uphill to where their water was located, several hundred feet away, and Calosha actually won that case. And so it's important that, taking the court decisions as it is, try to keep your water as close to the employees as possible.
Yes. Very, very good point. I sometimes see that, and I'm sure, David, you see this, is we get so focused on the actual regulation versus what makes sense to be best practice and making it practicable, right? And encouraging employees that, hey, you know what, we don't have to do the, hike to get the water. Make it easier for them. And that also encourages them to access that. That's the same with shade as well. So as I just mentioned, some of the water provision concerns in light of COVID-19 is, hey, if we're going to use communal water sources, how are we going to maintain hygiene, high touch, or again, high traffic areas? If you have more versus less water sources, you're going to have to keep in mind social distancing. Some of the things that people have gotten creative with is, hey, you know what? Instead of hand operated dispensers, can we use foot operated ones, right? Then this dispensing point is hands free. It's not being touched. We also have some customers who have opted for an attendant. Okay, not only to make sure that the water supply is hygienic and clean, but they're also mandating and observing that people are actually washing their hands, right, when they come on site, or sanitizing them. Just an extra level of safety and maintaining cross-contamination prevention. And then, as we mentioned again, is that distancing. Hey, closer versus further. Access to shade. You want to make sure that you have enough shade, especially when you reach the trigger of 80 degrees, that you have enough shade for your workers. Sometimes in the where we are in our build process, our project process, on site, you might have natural available shade for workers. As an example, garages, right? Or patio areas. But in light of COVID-19, now we have to factor in social distancing, right? And how we have access to those and how many people can actually occupy that area. So again, pre-planning, something to keep in mind is how many people you have on site today. Do we have enough shade for everyone? Okay, even when we don't reach the trigger temperature of 80, you should always be sure that you have enough shade for any medical emergencies, or, a first aid, rendering first aid, or observation. Remind your employees and workers that they are allowed and encouraged to take a cool down, especially with the facial coverings. I don't have, David, have you come across any citations as far as employees having issue with access to shade these days? I think it's getting better.
Mostly, the only citations that we're aware of is not having shade close enough to the workers.
Okay. So again, having enough. And that goes along with pre-planning. Having an idea with your look ahead schedule, how many people you anticipate to be on your job site, and making sure that you have enough. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, you need to have enough for emergency response procedures. Now, as I mentioned before, there's exceptions to this. Sometimes when we put up a pop-up, it's really windy, or the footprint of the job site doesn't really allow you to set up auxiliary shade structures. You may utilize alternative procedures. But again, it's best practice to do your pre-task, pre-work planning, your scheduling, so you can prove, should there be a question, hey, did you take the steps to assess and evaluate how you're going to deploy shade out at your job site? It's not, hey, we couldn't be bothered to get pop-up tents or put in, reasonable shade because of costs or what have you. We really want to see that you went through the assessment process before you go to secondary means of addressing shade. So except for employers in the agricultural industry, we can use other cooling measures other than shade, provided that you've gone through that assessment process, i.e., hey, well, let's just do misting machines. You need to demonstrate that it wasn't physically feasible to use traditional shade methods before you resort to misting cooling stations. David, do you have anything to add to this one?
Nope, you're doing fine. Keep going.
Okay. And again, shade concerns, social distancing. Hey, we need to increase the amount of shade space, maybe bring it closer to the work area. And again, we have that additional physical burden to cooling because of maybe additional gloves, additional facial coverings. So maybe also increasing the frequency of those rest breaks. Okay, high heat procedures. The trigger temperature is 95 degrees. When it's a really, really hot out or really, really humid out that day, you need to be sure that your communication methods are still effective. Okay. And now these days, I think we kind of get a little bit of tunnel vision, right? When we have a facial covering, right? Not only does it psychologically affect people about speaking, communicating with others, it also, it kind of acts like a set of blinders. Sometimes, you know, it sounds very strange, but that's how your brain perceives, you know, its environment is you get so focused with the facial covering on your face, you don't really pay attention to other things that are in your peripheral vision or your perception. So I want to mention that because that does happen a lot. You want to also have methods of observing your employees. Now that they have these facial coverings, right, all you see is a third of their face, and that may not be enough for you to observe any you know, sweating or lack of sweating, or how people have the increased social distance. So you're not as close to people, so you don't have as much visual assessment capabilities. Okay. And then, of course, we talk about the supervisor designee when they are assigned of 20 or fewer employees, that mandatory buddy system. Now we have, with social distancing, maybe there's a lot of tasks that you have sole employees, sole workers doing the work task, looking at means of checking in with them, be it phoning in, radioing in, or just walking by and having a verbal check-in with those employees. And then, of course, designating one or more of your team members to reach or contact EMS as a backup. Okay, I know sometimes we have responsible managing members, you know, managing more than one job site, and they're floating from job site to job site. It's very, very important that you have a backup and a secondary backup of someone who's aware of how you contact EMS in the event of a medical emergency. Okay, and then again, reminding people to drink water throughout the shift, and again, your huddles before you get to work, and also your tailboards, just reminding people again, hey, it's warm out, or it's really, really hot or humid out today. You need to be aware. We're going to have more check-ins, have a discussion with everybody. So again, just to summarize, is a buddy system better or versus social distancing? Having alternative means of check-ins and communication, being aware that we have additional physical burdens to cooling because of COVID-19 management. Okay. And then, hey, we might not be able to observe people with issues or challenges. So alternative means. David, anything to add here?
Nope. We're
Okay.
good.
Emergency response procedures. Even if it's not heat illness, emergency response in general at your site, making sure that if there's an emergency, is there someone who knows they can direct EMS when they arrive to the job site to direct them where they're at? Maybe central muster points, right? Depending on your site layout, you might have it divided into quadrants, right? And getting someone to the closest area so everybody is aware of agreed muster points where EMS, hey, you know what, there's an incident over here at the east corner. This is where the muster point is. So there isn't any confusion of how to access someone who needs medical assistance or help. And again, adjustments of response, first aid. In light of COVID-19, right, we're physically distancing ourselves. That's something that could be a concern. Hey, if we need to medically respond to someone, rendering first aid to someone. Okay, that's a concern. And as a matter of fact, you should have a discussion with your first responders. You know, are they comfortable with responding? Talking about social distancing, even CPR, right? As an example, you have the option of administering hands-free CPR, and it'd be a good time to have a refresher or discussion of, you know what, maybe you're not comfortable in administering traditional CPR with breaths. There's hands only, okay? And also temperature checks and monitoring. Now in light of COVID-19, here's kind of a bonus, right? We have on site a method of taking people's temperatures. Prior to COVID-19, you know, we didn't have a thermometer on site. Maybe it might have been in the first aid kit, but now with technology, we have digital touchless ways of evaluating temperature of a person. So maybe as a thought process, in addition to verbal check-ins with people and visual observations, you might want to do an additional temperature check. I think this is a great idea because you might see that people's temperature is a little bit higher. There's a rise in temperature. You encourage people to say, hey, you know what? You're getting a little bit warm here. Why don't you go take a little bit of a break? I think it's a great tool. Acclimatization, again, we need to keep an eye on people that are new to the task or new to the work, or it's the first part of a heat wave of the summer, right? It's unusually warm, it's unusually humid today, and we haven't had enough work days that working in this heat and this humidity. Very, very important to be extra vigilant and observant of people. I do have some customers that they have a new employee or a new person on site. They get identified as such. Okay, maybe they were recently onboarded. They try to buddy team up with somebody that's more seasoned, more experienced. But also, you know, if it's warmer, we all do little buddy check-ins. I think it's a great idea to do that. And again, I keep saying this, facial coverings. There's some research studies in industrial hygiene where they've done some studies about the additional heat burden and the heat load of wearing a facial covering or a mask while doing tasks. And of course, with the world of construction and the trades associated with construction, you know, there's those challenges because it's already a physically demanding job or task already. And now we're adding additional layers to our bodies and trying to do the work while it's hot out. And of course, in light of considering doing the work as a sole worker, sole employee versus having multiple people, that might be a harder job now physically, in addition to that facial covering. Training, very, very important. The heat illness prevention standard requires that employers educate and train their workers about what heat illness is, the awareness of heat illness, and how to address and manage that on site. I'm not going to read this verbatim. You'll get a copy of these, but very, very important. And of course, in light of COVID-19, you need to modify and perhaps change your existing heat illness prevention program to meet the requirements of managing the spread of COVID-19. And you need to facilitate the education and training with these changes. And again, as I mentioned before, conducting a site assessment, even in the pre-planning stage, to identify opportunities to tighten up on your training. David, anything to add to this as far as training goes?
No, nothing really. Just really some of the major things that's happened to employers is when they get cited for, not providing training for the signs and for the employees to recognize the signs and symptoms of heat illness. like fainting, dizziness, and, not sweating and all that. So it's important that you as employers, as part of your training, that you emphasize how the employees can recognize themselves, the symptoms of heat illness, because that's one of the questions that these enforcement guys, they do ask employees, they do interview employees. They ask them, hey, do you know what your procedures are? What do you do for emergency response? If you get sick, what are the signs and symptoms of it? Things to that nature, and what to do in case of emergency. So those are the questions that they ask, the enforcement officers ask the employees. And if they aren't able to answer those questions are then subsequently used as evidence for a hearing or a citations. So it's really important that you as employers, just if you haven't already done it already, shore up your training program and really discuss the finer points of this program with your employees. Do a sign-in sheet, quiz them if you can, to make sure that they understand the requirements. Quizzing is not a requirement, no way a requirement by Calosha, but it's a good way to show that the employee, understood it, and if they need additional attention to understanding the questions.
And to add to that, David, I'm sure you've had this question asked by some employers is, how am I going to do training as an employer where to validate our employees' knowledge teams, right? Like you said, reminding employees or, telling people where to reference this. Hey, I know I had the training, but here's a quick reference card. I have some customers, they give reminder cards to their employees, or it's posted on site. It's okay if you can't remember verbatim as an employee what all the procedures are, but where to seek that help or seek that guidance, right, David?
Yeah, so it's important that as an employer, you have means of communications, your tailgate safety meetings, your daily meetings, and so forth. So it's important that you discuss it with your employees and, and document your attendance, really, and also the topics that you discussed with that. When I do my consultative visits with employers, I always tell my employers, whatever you discuss with heat illness, COVID, fall protection, or whatever, you always want to have a sign-in sheet to show that you've discussed it with the employees, that their attendance name, that their name was on that sign-in sheet, and that you always have like an agenda or a list of talking points that you discussed with the employer, or a safety manual, or the operator's manual with a piece of equipment, just to show that you discuss certain things with the employees. It's one of those things that it's a little bit more work on the front end. Obviously, as builders, you want to get to, shooting your nails and laying roofing materials and so forth. But you really got to have the ability to really protect yourself on the front end by documenting and properly documenting it to help yourselves out.
So with that, David, that comes into your heat illness prevention plan, right? Having that in writing, something that's specific. It could be a general plan. If your organization, has nothing really that stands out that needs to be site specific, you should at least have a general plan. Or if you're working in a project or a site that is very, very unique how it's laid out, you maybe have a different agreement with the customer or the managing contractor, then you might have a site specific one. But at a minimum, you have to address those things that we just covered in the plan, the program. So some key takeaways. Again, conduct assessment of your job site to determine the best method or practice to ensure that you are in compliance with the heat illness prevention standard. Develop that site-specific plan. Making sure you have sufficient water. And I always tell people, have a backup, right? Because sometimes one reason or another, someone doesn't bring the water out or you assume something, always have a backup plan. Make sure you have emergency response procedures, review them, okay? And like David was saying, regular frequent review of that heat illness prevention program with everyone. Do it daily, have it included in your tailgates, plan ahead, see what the weather prediction is like for the week. If it's possible, adjust your workload or adjust the schedule to kind of reduce the amount of heat burden to people working out in the field. And again, educate and remind employees of the risk factors. In your job walks, your audits, validate that people have the knowledge and the information of how to react to it. And again, like what David said, we don't expect when they go out and they interview employees, they don't expect them to know chapter and verse, this is our company policy, just like your injury and illness prevention program. They want to validate that the employee has the awareness and they have the capability to access the information they need and act accordingly. Okay, some resources. There's actually a infection prevention in construction paper or guide with Calosha, and that was last updated October, correct, David?
Yeah, I don't quite remember when that was updated, but at least one of the general things with COVID-19 in construction is, part of your plan, you should also address, spacing out your shade structures, also adjusting your shifts for rest breaks to meet the social distancing guidelines of it. Now, there's been some updates with CDC regarding several COVID-19 related topics. Unfortunately, Calosha hasn't kept up to date or adopted those changes as of yet. So we're still kind of waiting to see what the Calosha Standards Board is saying regarding that. But at least at the bare minimum, take a look at your COVID-19 prevention program and at least address the heat illness portion of it with regards to shade, access to water, and so forth.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, David, because this was yesterday, I believe, on all the news channels, right? Everybody's like, hey, there's these new guidance standards with CDC about facial coverings, if you're vaccinated versus you're not vaccinated. But I'm glad you mentioned that, David, because as of this point in time, that is not going to be the current changes that Calosha is going to adopt right now. So that being said, I think at this point in time or during our discussion, if you refer to the COVID-19 infection prevention in construction that's issued by Calosha, that would probably be the best practice to observe right now at this point in time. Okay, some commonly asked questions and clarifications. David, feel free to jump in on this one. This is a common one. What is the best way to monitor the weather and evaluate the severity of environmental risk factors and heat illness? What are some of the ones that you suggest when you're working with employers?
I tell employers to check with the National Weather Services the day before and the day of.
Okay.
And that's pretty much usually the best way. And then there's, you want to check the heat index the morning of to see what the heat load is going to be like. And that way you can adjust your schedule if you can for the workday.
Okay. And is this still a burning question everybody always asks about water? What's considered suitably cool? And we talked about access already. The closest practicable, a lot of people are sometimes confused as far as the language in the standard.
So did you want me to go through all these questions or?
Yeah, you want to kind of summarize that real quick for everyone? Appreciate it.
All right. What's considered sufficient access to drinking water? kind of a broad question. In general, you want to make it as close to the employee as possible. And then basically not make it arranged where it would not encourage employees to drink water. So in other words, the location of it, accessibility of it. Also, you know, if you decide as an employer that you don't want to start off with the whole 2 gallons of water per day, you may want to start off with a gallon or so, but you really need to have in your written program measures on how to replenish that water content for your work site. So in other words, are you going to be using a fixed water facility? Are you going to go buy water? Are you going to have a stockpile of water bottles on hand to provide additional water should the employees run out? When is water suitably cool? That's pretty subjective. One thing that we've had in our frequently asked questions is, what's suitably cool? Well, it has to be cool enough where employees will actually be encouraged to drink it. If it's hot as hell, then, obviously they're not going to drink it. But one thing that you can, or if it's too cold, like ice cold, employees aren't going to drink that either. So what we recommend is having some ice on hand so that if the water becomes, unbearable to drink, you can put some ice in the water to cool it down so that way it's drinkable. That's one way of doing it. When is water as close as practical? Well, if you're building a residential structure, you probably want to have it, just close by. If they have to jump over a trench to get to it, that's probably not really that practical. If they have to climb up a hill, probably not. So you want to have it as close as possible, and also have the water, if possible, placed in the shade so it doesn't heat up as fast. What are appropriate sources of shade? That's a good question. Pop-up tents are good. Trees can be good. The sides of buildings can be good. As long as the employees can actually sit down on something and not on the ground, that's what we call appropriate amount of shade. Now with COVID, like we said earlier, you really got to have enough shade for everybody. And so with social distancing, you can't throw, a whole bunch of people in a shade structure like we did before. So you really got to really stagger that in your COVID-19 program. When is shade sufficient quality? Basically, you got to have enough shade so they can't really see like their shadow or where they're feeling the heat where they feel their neck burning. That's how I would describe it. What is acceptable access and location? We kind of discussed that. How much shade must be available, enough for all the employees. What if it is unsafe to provide a shade structure? That's a very good question. Usually in like really high windy days, you could probably use your car or a vehicle, but that vehicle must be running throughout the shift. You can't just throw a person inside that vehicle. Per our Calosha frequently asked questions, you can't just throw them in there, when it's 115 in the car and start the AC. That's just not acceptable to the division. So, that you could use cooling fans, misting fans. Those are okay, but you really got to really show why it's unsafe and what could be used as an equivalent. So the burden of proof is upon you to show, why you couldn't use shade in the first place.
And again, like you mentioned before, David, is that documentation, right? We've done that assessment. Hey, it's going to be really, really windy today, or maybe in the next 3 days. So what is plan B, right?
Yeah,
Very,
even
very
in windy
important.
cases, you could still use a pop-up tent. You could just lower down 2 of the legs and strap it down in most cases. But if you're like in the Imperial Valley or in Inland Empire or high desert where the winds are going up above 80 miles an hour. Obviously, that's going to be, pretty dangerous. So, you just got to figure out a better way of having shade in areas like high desert and
Yeah.
so forth.
Because it can be so windy, your job trailer might not be able to stay upright if it's not anchored.
Yeah, even high winds, even trekkers, when they're traveling down the road and there's, if they're going up 210 or 215 towards Las Vegas, if it gets too windy, they need to stop. Otherwise, if their truck tips over, they're liable for that damage. So kind of the same concept,
Yep.
If certain things may work, certain things may. So it's up to the employer to decide what's going to work.
Yes, yes. Great, thanks, David.
Sure.
So we talked about these earlier, some of these, and then we just kind of put it in a graphic representation. Okay. Hand washing water stations, cleaning and disinfection of common break areas, providing facial coverings and gloves. How are we going to worker symptom screening? I think it's kind of a nice takeoff is hey, you know what? Now we have touchless temperature monitoring means. You might even use that to supplement your monitoring for heat illness symptoms with employees, and then maintaining your social distancing. And then other patients, hey, scheduling, or we also have people that divide the work site in work pod areas. So maybe some administrative control. Any questions? I don't think we see anything in the Q&A chat box. We do. David, do you see that one?
I do. Let's see.
Okay.
Are employers opting for water bottles and ice chests instead? Thoughts on providing individual water igloos and having employees bring their own waters. So that's one of the things that some of the bigger general contractors are doing is supplying them with individual water bottles or purchasing their own personal igloo containers. That is an option that you can use. And so that is available. So it's up to you. Now, in a prior news blast, they were saying that, if you want to use a single container, you just have to have an effective procedures to sanitize the spigots and so forth. But, as an employer, how feasible is to have somebody kind of just sit there and sanitize it after each use, and how reliable is it to ask employees to do that after themselves? So usually what employers do is they just provide the water bottles individually to employees and deal with it that way. Did you say if someone hot, you may not put them in a car with the AC running? You have the way that that's a good question. There's court decisions that's out there with regards to that, which says that, the car must have been running the whole shift with the AC on in order for that to work. So you can do it, but you can't put an employee in a car as long as the AC has been running and working effectively previously to that employee needing it.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
So just really briefly, and I'll have this at the end of the second module as well, is here's our contact information. Laura's email is at the bottom of this slide. So if signing in and all we see is your phone number, and that's what's displayed, we don't know where to send your attendance certificate to. So be sure that you reach out to Laura and let her know that you have attended today's session. Okay, we're going to move on to slips, trips, and falls. I'm going to talk about the costs of slips, trips, and falls, talk about the exposures, the considerations, and controls of those exposures, and then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. So Liberty Mutual produces what we call a workplace safety index annually. And we actually have one specifically for the construction industry. And I wanted to share with you a couple of takeaways that the Workplace Safety Index shows as far as in relative to slips, trips, and falls. Serious non-fatal injuries cost the construction industry 189, almost $190 million a week in costs. Isn't that mind-boggling? Okay. And total workers' compensation direct costs, okay, things that, you know, medical treatment, medical bills, time away from work. We're not even talking about the indirect costs, right? That, you know, you have a great team working together, you have someone that's out from injury, kind of disrupts, you know, the production and the flow of work. Those are what we call like indirect costs, right? And having someone, bringing on someone else that's on board to your team, training them and getting them up to speed, that's another direct indirect cost. So the top 5 types of situations where someone has 5 days away or more from work. Number 1, falls to a lower level. 2, struck by an object or a piece of equipment. 3 is overexertion. Okay, that also includes heat illness, right? Or, you know, a physical muscle skeletal strain or sprain to someone's body. So, but heat illness would be included in number 3. Number 4 falls on the same level. And then, of course, we also have a slip or a trip without an actual fall, right? You can have a strain, you can bump against something and get hurt. So you see, falls, that's 3 of the 5 top 5. So the sum of all total of slips, trips, and falls is $4.3 billion. Okay. That's in a year. That accounts for 43.71% of those costs. That's a lot. That's why we wanted to discuss and focus on this today. And I have some pictures and some items to share with everyone. And I'm sure it'll be a very, very good discussion with everybody on the call today. And again, feel free to either raise your hand or put something in the chat box. I know there's a lot of us on the call today, but we'll aggregate those and have a very, very good discussion in regards to these. I call these frequent flyers. Housekeeping, that includes debris and trash on the job site. Use of ladders, right? In our trade, there's a lot of trades and specialty trades that use ladders. How you select them, how you set them up, how you use them. Scaffolding, access and egress on a job site. You have open wall and floor openings. You have missing railing or areas that need steps. There's no steps, lack of steps. Elevation changes, okay? Open holes and excavations. And of course, your job site, your project is always a work in progress, right? Depending on where we are in the build, you're going to always have physical properties that exist. They may exist only for a week, a few days, but they represent trip hazards, fall hazards, slip and fall hazards. Yeah, and of course, slippery, uneven ground, footing, our most favorite thing, power cords, extension cords, and then of course our material piles and how we stage materials out there. And then one of these things, and I'm sure David is nodding his head, is the improper use of personal fall arrest systems and the lack of fall protection plans when we're doing our work out on our projects and job sites. David, do you have anything to add to the frequent flyer list?
No, not really. Just employee. Usually, the biggest thing that we usually find is employee training with regards to tools and machinery. That's really one of the biggest ones too. Just improper use of it. So, anyways, not to take away from your presentation, but this is good.
Okay. Improper use of anything, right?
Pretty much.
Yes. So exposures, I kind of had 2 pictures here to kind of illustrate you know, we might not be actually building structures yet, but we're actually prepping, right? So we talked about uneven ground, and this kind of goes back into our previous subject, right? Water. Hey, it could be a hot sunny day out there and we're doing, you know, land prep out there, getting things prepped up, excavation, and it's really hot. Do we have shade? Do we have water? Even though this is kind of a very dynamic job site, you kind of have to plan ahead here, you know. And then the picture on the right, now we have buildings going up, and now we have a ladder. And, you know, as we start building, and there's less and less of open space and area for you to set your materials, and the traffic pattern changes, and it depends on how many trades are on site. Everybody might be working in close proximity to each other, but you should have that awareness to keep access and egress clear for everyone that's working in the area. So here's a topic that I'm sure is near and dear to everyone's heart, whether or not you specifically work with scaffolds, but you probably encounter scaffolds on your project, directly or indirectly. Here are some examples of scaffolding at a job site where it's not properly erected or set up. David, you have something to add to these pictures?
Yeah, it's pretty obvious what's wrong with this. So, just proper supervision. Your foremans, I know the foremans always like to be like their employees' best friends, but they really need to, earn their pay and take care of this. Otherwise, their foreman becomes a liability for your company when you don't start enforcing proper setup.
And some of the kind of warning signs is, you start asking questions. Hey, did we plan ahead with the correct equipment or enough material to set this up, right? Because in these pictures, I wasn't personally there where these pictures were taken, but it begs to question, did we do enough pre-planning when we were getting ready to do this project, right? And using the equipment in the correct manner. Okay, these railings, we've inserted clip-in railings. Is that acceptable by the manufacturer, right? Those are some of the questions that we're going to ask. And again, here's another picture at a different site. So this is not one of those one-off things. This begs to question, like what David said, hey, did you guys plan for this job? When you set up this type of scaffold, did you select and plan and deliver the correct materials and the right materials to set this up? Here we have the more traditional type of scaffolding and planking. Planking continues to be a challenge, and this is probably a commonly observed thing that OSHA sees. Yes, David, do you want to add some comments to these pictures?
Oh, just keep going.
Okay. And this is access and egress, right? How are we going to go from, in the left-hand side picture, traverse from the left side to the right side of this structure? It's not fully planked. And someone might argue, well, we're just moving boards and, there's mud on them, we flip boards. But you know what? If scaffolds are being used by other trades and a particular trade is responsible for the condition of this, that you have to have management controls of accessing your scaffold. What about this picture? We kind of talked about tools, right? Briefly, David had mentioned, improper use of tools. In this picture, you see that there are two people on this scaffold, and you see the bow on that board. So it begs the question, is that the sufficient planking? Is this designed for a load limit of 2 people? David, you have something to add about planking as far as load limits and specs on this?
No, nothing to add. It's pretty straightforward in our regulations. So
yeah. So kind of has maybe a coaching moment. If you were walking your site and you see this, this is a time to have a discussion. Hey, you know what? This is what I see. I don't think this is very safe. You know, what was this scaffold designed to take load wise? You know, because in addition to people on this, you also have tools and materials. And then I'd like to add here, we have a nail gun that's just being hung here on the railing. And, you know, you might have people walking by here, and this is a struck by. That's another OSHA, you know, top 4, right? And again, I like using this picture as an illustration here. You have bits and pieces of different types of scaffolding put together. Okay. And it looks pretty incomplete. And this was, to me, says, hey, you know what? We didn't plan ahead, and we just made use of what we had on hand on site to get this done. So we have missing railing up here at the top level, and egress here. You have people kind of hopping over this area. It's not sufficiently railed or guarded. What about this? Self-made, job-made scaffolding. Do you allow this on your site? Do you permit this? And in this instance, we have this job-made scaffolding, but there's no railing really, is there? David, do you have anything to add to this picture? Have you seen this?
Yeah, I've seen that a few times. That's not the most pleasant thing to see.
Yes. You're creating a greater fall risk. So again, when you encounter situations like this, things that come to mind, you know, hey, we already saw pictures about end rails on the guardrail system. Is there safe access? Here in this picture, you see that the employee recognized, hey, you know what? I need to get to a lower level, and the scaffold didn't provide for that. So, hey, you know what? I'm going to get creative. I'm going to use this step ladder as a bridge to get to the lower level. Okay. Not only is that unsafe, that also adds an additional fall or slip trip hazard as well. Here's another pictorial example of, you know, creativity, unsafe creativity, right? And again, it's a telltale sign that that trade did not have an assessment or a plan of how to do the work safely and address those fall hazards. Ladders. Here in this example, okay, we're using a ladder, but are we using it correctly? Did we select the correct ladder? Okay, A-frame ladders are meant to be used as an A-frame ladder, not as a lean-to or an extension ladder. And in this case too, it's set up on some extra boards, so that kind of tells me either we're staging materials and we couldn't be bothered to move them out of the way and we just stuck the ladder on top of it, or B, we needed that additional height to get to where we need to do our work. David, do you have anything to add to this picture?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys know, but there's new ladders called the lean safe ladders out there, which you could do pretty much do the same thing. And those lean safe ladders where you could lean it up against a stud like that, those are acceptable to Calosha as long as they were engineered for it. The only problems that we see when using this ladder on the job site is there's a yellow safety clip that goes with that ladder. It's only when that clip is not engaged with the back 2 legs, that's when it becomes a citable deal for Calosha, because you're not using it according to the manufacturer's recommendations. So it's really important that if you do have these lean safe ladders, which again, they are perfectly legal in Calosha world, just make sure that your employees are using the clips that are attached to it. Now, sometimes what we see is that those clips are broken. And when those are broken, that in itself is, again, a citable condition for Calosha enforcement, because, again, it's not being maintained safely by the employer and it's not being used. So make sure that if you do have the ladders, the lean safe ladders, that you do check those clips to make sure that they're in good working orders. But in essence, leaning a regular 6-foot A-frame ladder like this, that's an easy deal. So try to make sure that your foremans are enforcing the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, what you just said, as far as that's key, manufacture design, and you're maintaining that equipment and using it according to the manufacturer's guide and instructions. That goes the same with scaffolding, right? We saw a couple pictures where there's scaffold parts and components from different manufacturers. As long as it's indicated in the manufacturer that it's okay to commingle parts or what it accepts in the railings, that's fine. But if you get creative and it's outside the manufacturer's scope of design and application, and you're not maintaining it as required, you are in violation, and it's also rendering an unsafe condition. So here's another picture of a ladder, and I'll kind of throw in here, you know, we're wearing athletic shoes on this job site. So, you know, safety footwear, PPE, and then in the background, I just want to bring that up, you know, housekeeping, right? You got people coming in and out of here, you got cords, you got material. Sometimes we're very focused on carrying bulky, large pieces of building material through a building. Someone's going to slip, trip, and fall on that. Okay, here's another fall risk, coordinated by being struck by or caught in between when we're dealing with live loads, right? We might be on that ladder that's properly set up, but you might come off of that ladder because you're touching that live load. So again, this is something, a common task that's on a job site. Just a big reminder to everyone to be aware of that. I think the pictures are worth 1,000 words right here. This is probably we've all seen this at some point. You know, if you said you've never seen this somewhere, you'd be lying. David, do you want to have some comments to these pictures?
No, it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah. So it's pre-planning again, right? Hey, you know what? We need to do some touch-up, some patch-up work. Hey, the scaffold's gone. How are we going to do this? Okay. And then one thing I'm sure that's near and dear to David's heart and my heart is personal fall arrest system use or incorrect use. So fall protection equipment or fall arrest systems are wonderful pieces of equipment to use, but if you don't know how to apply them or use them, you might as well not wear them. So this picture illustrates that, you know, they're using the same anchor point. Hey, you know what? If the anchor point's designed to take 2 people, that's fine. Here we're using an SRL, okay, self-retractable lanyard. Okay, it's being used backwards, and it's also anchored to a 6-foot lanyard. And the likelihood of the person making contact with the ground is very, very high. I'm also going to mention at this point that there is also what we call SRLLEs, leading edge self-retractable lanyards. Those are designed to deal with a leading edge, because when you take a fall and the cable makes contact with the sharper leading edge, it's jacketed in such a way that it's not going to shear and actually get cut off. There's actually a very, very compelling video out there. I think somebody was doing a test to show the difference between a traditional SRL and a specifically designed leading edge SRL, one versus the other, taking a load incident, I think an ANSI test. But it's very, very important if you're using SRLs on a leading edge that you use the correct type of SRL. David, do you have anything to add to this?
not only using the correct SRL, but checking to make sure the SRL works properly. There's a little pull tag at the top of the pull loop on the very top of the SRL that if you show any indication of red on that, that you got to take it out of service. And also when you're testing it, try not to yank it so hard, because every yank is going to count towards that a millimeter of red to show, and eventually that thing's going to be bad. So it's really important that you guys really, check those SRLs and the cables and the lanyards, make sure that they're in good working order before letting an employee use it.
Okay. And again, check the manufacturer's instructions and guide on how you maintain and validate the protection of this equipment. Best practice, you want to avoid using a lanyard with an SRL. Okay. Very, very few instances that you would do that. And again, that's common. Hey, we didn't get the one with the right length. That's too short, too long. We're going to modify it. Trip hazards. There's always trip hazards on the job site. Some you cannot protect, some you're just going to have to increase awareness. Okay. Elevation changes, access and egress. Okay. So we're going from dirt to foundation. There's a step up here. David, do you have anything to add to this picture? This is something you commonly see out on site, right? The makeshift.
Yeah,
tank.
Really, when there's an elevation change of greater than 18 inches, that's where you need like some sort of chicken board or something to allow for them to step up. So seeing something like this is very encouraging.
Okay. And again, this picture kind of encapsulates, hey, we have extension cords, we have some debris pile, and of course we have like stub ups here. So these are some of the common challenges, and maybe with pre-planning, hey, you know what, maybe we designate a pathway of how everybody gets through to where they're going, so we don't have 10 people taking 10 different paths, right? Because sometimes when you're in a hurry, everybody wants to take the shortest route from point A to point B, but it could be very, very dangerous, especially with open holes and excavations, right? We generally have those covered, but we're getting ready to do work and we pull all these covers, but sometimes out of convenience, someone goes around and pulls the covers off of all 8 excavations versus pulling them off one at a time. And when you're finished, you cover it, or you uncover all of them and you go on a lunch break and all the delineators and all the flags are taken away. Nobody's bothered to replace them because they said, you know what, we'll be back in 30 minutes. And then you might have another trade on site that shows up and they're not aware of that because they've only been on the site just for only 10 minutes and then you have an incident. Anything to add about open holes and excavations, David?
No, not at this time.
Okay. So controls. Probably heard me say it a few times, big hint. Pre-planning and scheduling, I think, is key. Having communication with all those that are on site, having some accountability, collaborate. And like David said, education and awareness. I think that's huge. Picture on the right kind of shows, hey, you know what? We're going to have some open wall openings here. Why don't we install the railings first? That kind of cuts down on some rework. It's a little bit more efficient. They're in there and it protects the people that are working on that floor. And we don't have challenges of trying to have additional people exposed to falls while we're installing the railing itself. Just some thoughts. So I think we're running a little bit over here, but something you might want to think about is what do you see personally that are frequent challenges at your site? I think some of the things we've talked about today, I think those are some of the ones that you do see. What are some of the ideas and opportunities? And some solutions. Some of the things that David has mentioned. Hey, you know what? There are some ladders out there. think Little Giant and some other ones, where there's actually a V cut out at the top with a special clip where you can in fact use an A-frame ladder as a lean-to ladder. But again, it's only effective if you maintain it and use it as designed by the manufacturer. I see cordless tools out there. You know, they're really great because now you don't have to deal with the spaghetti of flexible cords, cords that are in ill repair. But then you should also have the awareness is if we're plugging in all these batteries and everything, do we have designated areas? Because that could also be overloading the system. The picture on the left, we have a railing system in a stairwell. That's great. I've seen reusable boots that you can use to put up temporary railing for stairwells and staircases. Second picture, we have mushroom caps, okay, over rebar, and we actually have tape around the open hole. Last picture, we have a ladder with a anchoring system, a securement system to keep that ladder from sliding off when it's being used. So there's a lot of solutions and new ideas out there. So something to consider, but also the awareness. Sometimes the solutions might pose a new hazard that you need to address as well. David?
Nope, nothing to add.
Okay. So again, I'm putting up this contact information slide. If you have any questions that we haven't addressed, or maybe you have something as an afterthought, feel free to reach out to us. Again, thank you, David, for joining us today. Thank you, Brad, Tony, and Rod for putting this together and supporting this webinar today. And thank you to BIASC. Does anybody have any closing comments? Brad? David, it looks like you have a question. Do you want to bring that up?
Yeah, I just answered it.
Okay.
So
Any
one thing I want to point out, we had a question regarding anchor bolt covers from an anonymous attendee. It made point of that one picture that you had where you had some foundations with them exposed anchor bolts. Just want to let you know that Calosha has cited in the past, and that citation was sustained in appeals court and up to a higher court, where anchor bolts are required to be covered with rebar covers or anchor bolt covers, something 4 by 4 inch in diameter, which can provide impalement protections for employees. So this is pretty common out in some residential establishments and even in some light commercial job sites where anchor bolts are uncovered. And so at that point in time, if a compliance officer does come out and sees that, they can issue a serious citation for an instance such as that. So moving forward, just make sure that you guys can check your anchor bolts and make sure that they are capped for any exposed anchor bolts that you have on site.
Great. Any other questions? No? I apologize that we ran a little bit over, but hopefully this was of value to everyone. And again, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to David or myself.
Yeah, also, if I can, real quickly, Amy, we had a couple questions regarding, stuff created by other employers. Like, for example, planks being removed from interior scaffolding to be used by outside crews. And it creates an unsafe environment for their employees. So whenever you have like a scheduling issue or resource issues where you're seeing stuff that's missing on the job site in which a general contractor should have provided to you, the general contractor would have some liability in this because they're allowing certain things to occur. So it's important to you as subcontractors that you bring these issues in regards to resources, safety issues, and scheduling with your general contractors to make sure that these items are addressed. Because if you have, one of my pet peeves is stacking trades. And so when you have like multiple trades working on top of each other, it creates a hazard for another employer. And the GC's like, oh well, whatever. Then that's kind of a problem, because that's where the general contractor would get pulled into it from a multi-employer Calosha standpoint. Okay, so it's important that you guys, again, subcontractors, address with your general contractors, and general contractors, just from a scheduling standpoint, just try not to stack any trades where it would create any problems from a scheduling and a resource standpoint.
That's a very, very good point, David. And, you know, we talk about on the subject of joint employer responsibility, right? Your company is not the one who's put up that scaffolding, but you have that expectation of your employees. If they recognize that that's an unsafe condition, they shouldn't just ignore it and just get on the scaffold and do the work.
Yeah, we still have issues when we talk to employers and we see issues and they say, oh, not my monkey, not my circus. And so, like, okay, not true. Let's put the multi-employers lens on here real quick, and then you'll see, like, okay, yeah, now we got some issues here, and the multi-employer situation would apply, and all the contractors involved, including the subcontractors, will eventually get dragged into it. So really, you know, the employees, after talking to employees in the fields, they still have that issue. Hey, it's not my problem. It's like, well, from the employer standpoint, it is. So
Yeah.
I think there's an educational aspect
Yes.
to it that needs to be approached with your employees, both from a general contractor standpoint and the subcontractor standpoint, that everybody has liability. And I don't think that message has gone across to a lot of the employees. So, you know, one thing that can help you is just to address it.
Yes. And that goes back to, you know, accountability and collaboration and education, right? We all work on that job site and we all need to work together.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it sounds like we had all the questions, but if you missed any or you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. And again, if you signed in with the phone and we can't assess that it's you, and because the identifier is a phone number, feel free to reach out to Laura Barber, and she will get you lined out for an attendance certificate. So apologize for running a little bit over, but I think hopefully everybody got something out of today's webinar, and thank you again, and everybody have a great and safe day.